Good evening, virtual audience, and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Hillary Carr, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm very pleased to introduce this event with Joel Christian Gill presenting his new book, Robert Smalls, the third volume in his Tales of the Talented 10th series, joined in conversation by Tim Fielder and Nate Powell. Thank you all for joining us virtually tonight. Through events like this, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community during this time. Every week, we'll be hosting events here on our Zoom account. As always, our event schedule also appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can sign up for our email newsletter and browse our bookshelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time throughout the talk, you can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase Robert Smalls on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you for showing up and tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings this past year, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly, and we thank you ahead for your patience and understanding. And now, I'm so pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Joel Christian Gill is an award-winning cartoonist and historian and a professor of illustration at Massachusetts College of Art and Design. He is the author and artist of the Cartoonist Studio Prize-winning memoir Fights, One Boy's Triumph Over Violence, which was named one of the best graphic novels of 2020 by the New York Times. He's also the author and artist of Fast Enough, Bessie Stringfield's First Ride, the award-winning graphic novel series Strange Fruit, Uncelebrated Narratives from Black History, and the Tales of the Talented 10th series, which tells the stories of Bass Reeves, Bessie Stringfield, and Robert Smalls. Tonight, Joel will be joined by acclaimed cartoonist Tim Fielder, whose works include Save It for Later, Come Again, and John Lewis's March Trilogy, and Nate Powell, whose works include Maddie's Rocket, Infinitum, and Black Metropolis. These three will be discussing Joel's latest book, Robert Smalls, from his Tales of the Talented 10th. In a starred review, Kirkus called Robert Smalls an inspiring saga of a real-life hero, saying that the colorful panels fully express the taut drama of the venture. And Ibram X. Kendi, author of Stamped from the Beginning and How to Be an Anti-Racist, said that Tales of the Talented 10th is a testament, in the words of W.E.B. Du Bois, that everyday Black people stand under the sun with bravery and courage to represent us. Going on to say that Gill shows how ordinary people fight for our collective liberation and whose stories are not often at the forefront of our historical consciousness. We're so happy to have all three of them here tonight. So without further ado, the digital podium is yours, Tim, Nate, and Joel.
So I got everybody's books.
Don't worry, man. We got it up here, right here. This is his book, folks.
So you guys don't know, but right before we showed up, I was just telling Nate and Tim that I don't have any of my books yet because they haven't shipped to me, so I didn't have any books. And so Tim just decided he was going to be my hype man and just basically.
I'm the hype man today. Joel Christian Gill, baby. Joel Christian Gill. Let's get it. Robert Smalls, get it.
This is really, really, really informal. Like on most of the presentations that I've given, you know, I do like a slideshow and I talk about like the importance of telling stories. But really, like today, I'm just going to talk to Nate and Tim, like people who I am a fan of and people whose work I really admire. Nate specifically. So I met Nate, you know, years ago. And before I met Nate, I actually purchased, where is it? Is it on my shelf? Swallow Me Whole, which was like incredible. And then I met Nate and it was great. And I was like fanboying, you know, like this is such an amazing book. And then Tim, I met Tim in a bunch of different places over the course of the years, but I've had him come to, and I love his work. Although I will say this, I've been in a bunch of events with Tim, and Tim has yet to draw a caricature of me.
I was going to do it on this tablet. I was going to draw it today, but your publisher didn't send you a book, so now I got to be the hype man.
But, you know, I don't know. So, you know, like when I talk to my students about this, and you guys have both visited my class and my students, I talk about like the idea of how comics, you know, are this storytelling vehicle that is a tricky way to teach people stuff. And I know, Tim, your work is not necessarily about 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 history, and Nate, you've worked on books, of course, you've worked on books about history. So what for you guys, and then I'll join in as I ask, but for you guys, what's like the most difficult thing about translating like the ideas that we have in our head directly onto paper to like tell a story? Nate, you can go first.
For me, I think what has taken the longest to figure out, like as a weakness and as something that I just automatically do, is really trusting advice that I've gotten carefully over the years, mostly from editors, that I'm a storyteller who likes to leave things out. I like keeping certain things vague and unresolved, and I like letting a reader kind of string themselves along and make connections. But the most difficult thing for me has been to understand that my job is to actually take a reader somewhere with some kind of measurable clarity. So a lot of my really this is the difference between when I started working on March and before March. The first 3 or 4 books I did were really dreamy and out there as far as what the reader is how the reader is expected to stay in the zone that the creator sets up. And thankfully, I think over the course of March, I recognize that if I'm asking a reader to kind of stay in the zone with me, but I'm not giving them the tools to keep their attention with the narrative that I'm setting up, then it's not really fair to expect the reader to stay along. So it made me pay a lot more attention about making sure that I'm being concrete about something that needs to be established or needs to be continued or carried through different parts of the story. And that lets me stay weird in other spots in my book. But I think the clarity and the concreteness and just not assuming that a reader is going to be there with me 100% of the time based on my own weird storytelling. So it's a lot of it's kind of just like getting out of my own head.
Yeah. What about you, Tim? What's like the hardest thing?
Yeah, well, one of the things, that's the challenge about sequential storytelling. It's really about trying to make sure that you allow space for the iterative storytelling process. So meaning for me specifically, even though the words may come first or the pictures, that breakdown is essential. For those folks who don't know what a breakdown is essentially a rough, drawing of your actual comic page, the one, sequentially. And I find that process is iterative. You do it and then you stop and you let somebody see it, then you do it again, you update. And that part can be very painful, but as Nate was saying, it's about a continual process of maturing your story so that the audience can get it. Now, for me personally, I like to pull back a little bit. I like to not explain everything. They're like, my editors are definitely like, well, why are they doing that? I'm like, well, because that's what they're doing and there's no need to explain it. Also understanding that because we work in the field of graphic novels or funny books, it is really that dance between the picture and the word. It is that dance. And sometimes that dance can be like Toilet Art, it can be modern dance. You don't know what the hell's going on, but that's just part of it. That's my opinion.
It's true.
No, I think, yeah, I wouldn't disagree with either one of what you said. Like the hardest thing for me specifically, because most of my characters are always history, except for Fights, which was about me. But like telling the story of Robert Smalls, it's like the picking and choosing what you're going to say about him and then how to tell the story, right? So, because I don't want to just tell like some boring historical like so first this happened, then this happened. Like, you know, I always think about like, I'm not fanboying, but I'm being honest. I always think about the first couple of pages of March book 1 that almost made me cry at SPX when I got the copy of it. And I open that up and I feel that immediate like emotion, right? It wasn't like John Lewis was born in such and such and such and such a place. It was like hitting you with the story first. And I think that that's the thing that I struggle with telling these stories about people, because you need to tell a story. So with Bass Reeves, it was like Bass Reeves arrested his son. That was a really traumatic thing. So I need to build the story about him around him arresting his son. Bessie Stringfield was this free-spirited, you know, Black woman in the 1920s. She was just off. So this needs to be an adventure. This needs to be about this one, like Black girl magic, like personified, right? Just like going and doing stuff. And with Robert Smalls, it was hard, right? Because I was trying to think like, how to tell the story about, you know, this enslaved African who basically stole, you know, millions of dollars worth of property and people and sailed it through like Confederate water. I'm like, all right, I'm going to make this a heist story, right? It's going to be like a heist, right? It's going to be, you know, Robert Smalls and his compatriots like dividing a plan and then taking it and putting it into fruition. So like, that's like the way I think about like telling the stories, is like trying to figure out what that catch is for any individual story. Like, and so like, that's what it was for Robert Smalls, is like, I want to make this about a heist, because stealing, you know, 17, I think it was total 17 people with himself and his family was like, that's $17,000 just in that money, plus the warship, which would have been like $100 million, right? Like that's all it. Go ahead, Tim.
But let's be clear. If anything would have gone wrong, mutilation.
Yeah, like this wasn't like,
oh, you did a bad thing, let's send you to jail.
Yeah.
You broke the law. No, people would have died. They would have been lynched.
Exactly.
So as I'm reading the story, it starts off innocently enough, you know, if that could be said, but then as you're getting into the planning part, and then you know, oh Lord, this guy, you know, I can't go into, because no spoiler alert, I'm not trying to do that. It's like, oh Lord, what is he going to do? Because this guy has this issue. How's he going to get past that? Okay, is everybody going to do their job? Are they going to show up when they're going to? And it's you never reveal what happens, and it builds over time. And plus, you got those freaking panels on the page. It's like, you don't get us there quick. You make us sweat a little bit. And I love that. I thought that it was really spot on. And just brilliant storytelling. Really well done.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. Like go ahead, Nick.
Well, I was just going to say, in terms of the thriller angle, the heist angle, it sort of took me by surprise. By the time I got to the end of the book, Robert Smalls goes on to have this incredible, varied and storied life even after the bulk of this narrative, and it kind of hits you, because yes, you are caught up in a heist narrative where the stakes are people's lives. But it's interesting because like you're in Robert Smalls, you're narrating this from a viewpoint of planning, coordination, and action. And so I like how you kind of keep your storytelling, not just, well, you keep it centered on Robert, but especially when you pull back and you're showing Charleston and you're showing the water and the surrounding areas and how all of these escape plans are coordinated, you're also kind of decentralizing his role by emphasizing how all of these moving parts need to work in order for anything to work. And it's just really fascinating.
I mean, I just like, you know, like the more I read about Robert Smalls, yes, Luther just asked a question. Is Tim going to hold up the tablet the whole time? Yes, he's going to be holding up the tablet the whole time.
I'm the hype man today. Remember that. It's not JOEL CHRISTIAN GILL today. You don't have to ask that. I'm going to do what I got to do. Go ahead. Keep talking, sir.
No, Tim came into my class and it was like, supposed to be talking about his work and talking about his book, and legitimately just like started talking to, he was like my hype man at that point. He was just like, you don't know who you're teaching. Joel Gill is like, you don't even know. I'm like, Tim, this is not about me. This is about you. Talk about your work. But anyways.
See, that's another thing. That's another thing. A lot of people don't understand how complex it is to both produce the work and then teach process.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't understand the kind of, it's not Faustian, although I would imagine it might feel that way, but it's that bargain you make to be able to produce your work, and you share, you overshare. I'm like, yo, man, why are you telling them that? But you tell your students what's up. You tell
Yeah,
them.
I mean, it's like when it's, you know, when you're teaching comics and you're teaching this idea of like, this is a visual narrative that you're trying to do something, right? So when teaching this, because Nate, you didn't go to school for comics, right? You went to school for illustration, right?
No, I was actually a cartooning major. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Indeed.
Because I wasn't. Tim, I don't think you were, right? You didn't go to school for comics, right?
Yeah, I was there for a year and a half and drove my teachers crazy.
All right. So but ultimately what I'm saying is that there were when we all started drawing comics, right? There were very few opportunities to learn, right?
Yeah.
So like I was like in Southwestern Virginia, there were no comics programs. So I ended up doing graphic design and then painting, and I got my MFA in painting, and now I draw comics. Like it's legitimately, I went all the way around my asshole to get to my thumb. Sorry if there were kids listening, but that's exactly what happened, right? But you know, like telling the students, it's like when you're teaching students to tell stories, like I feel like I'm in boot camp, right? I feel like I am the drill sergeant. I am yelling at you to make sure that you do this stuff because I know what it's going to be like out there. What's going to happen out there is what most students don't understand is that you're going to have this like we all strive. I'm sure you guys are the same way. Like nobody's going to be sitting over your shoulder saying, okay, Nate, you should move this panel over because I think that should flip a little bit better. No, you're just in your studio by yourself. And people, when you show anybody, right, your wife or your kids or anybody else, like those people don't care because you do it all the time. And it's just like, okay,
Right.
yeah, it's talking, right?
It's blindness to the
yeah,
process.
and then if you show it to anybody else who's a friend of yours, they're just going to be like, oh, you're great. This is amazing. I love everything you're doing. And to get that real sort of like real feedback, which I don't think people understand. That's why I do that, right? Because the students, when they're with me, is at that short amount of time of being able to get that real feedback on storytelling and just how that stuff, how that kind of relates to what we're trying to do. And I think the broader, I'm gonna go back to storytelling for a minute. The broader conversation about let me reset. The more difficult thing, one of the things that I found the most difficult, and maybe Tim, you can relate to this because when you were doing Infinitum, since it's Afrofuturism, you're dealing with like stories of like, you're making up everything, right? Like the buildings, the trees, the clothes, the everything, right? You're making all that stuff up.
Well, no.
Okay.
No, because Infinitum is a story about an immortal. It starts in the distant past, which I have to research.
Right.
Societies, how they look, approximate that. Then you go through the civil rights movement, contemporary time. So all that stuff had to be researched, which was a freaking drag, right? But then once you get to that, then all of a sudden you got to start building all these spaceships, and that's fun, but then that's a drag too. It's
that's what I mean. But like with the spaceships and like, because like what most people forget about comics, right?
Right.
Is that, like when you're trying to tell comics and you're trying to use it as a storytelling medium, right? Like, for example, I'm working on Stamped right now, right? So Ibram writes, Thomas Jefferson was sitting in his house writing letters, right? That's what Ibram writes. And so in order for me to translate that in, I have to go, okay, what kind of pants were Thomas Jefferson wearing? What did his pen look like? What did the desk look like? Should I research the inside of Monticello in order to get this exactly right? Because you do that, right? You go down the rabbit hole and then you're like, is it important for storytelling for that? Like how much of that is important to storytelling? And so when I was talking about like you making up, I wasn't talking about the beginning part of the book, but like the end part of the book, like making up costumes and like coming, like for Robert Smalls is wearing like a jacket on the cover of that book. Because I was just like, okay, what do these guys, like I was like researching sailors' uniforms, like what did the Confederate sailors wear versus those, and then drawing that stuff, because you have to think about all of that stuff. You have to think about the light, you have to think about the time of day, I don't know if you guys do, but I have a mirror in my studio so that I could like make faces to like make it look like, I'm doing a thing. And I think people miss those kind of things.
I feel like at least 80% of the work that goes into a comics page is invisible work, and particularly doing nonfiction or doing something that's springboarding off of a historic background, there is no end to how deep you can go, right, as far as setting the stage. One thing I discovered when I was doing The Silence of Our Friends, I guess that was my first real foray into having to do a period piece that was against a backdrop of the civil rights movement, was, I'd say, on day 2, where I realized that I didn't know anything about the shoes people wore in the mid 1960s. And then I was like, uh-oh, it doesn't stop there, does it? And then I was like, wait, everything on every panel. And then I was like, I don't really care about that. And so like the last 10 years has been me figuring out exactly what level I need to make myself care to sort of sell the illusion for a reader of being there, being in the moment, and then knowing when to stop and when to just fake it. And I always really admire other cartoonists where that's their thing, like Colleen Doran and Becky Cloonan both. They seem to get really into like researching the types of like leather laces used on 14th century boots, and like it's amazing just to note the differences and curiosities people have, but particularly because there's no part of me that gets excited when I have to like research what type of boot laces people are using in the 17th century or whatever.
What's
So,
funny about that is that, so 2 things happened when I was researching this book versus when I was researching Bass Reeves. When I was researching Bass Reeves, there's a scene in the book where I have Bass Reeves shooting shooting a can off of a tin. And so like I legitimately went and researched the tin cans exist at this time and went down a rabbit hole of learning exactly when tin can, and then got to halfway through it and was just like, I don't really need that, right? But with Robert Smalls, I was reading and I came across a research paper about the causes of the Civil War and how it was like a peer review paper. So it was like somebody making this argument that Lincoln didn't actually have the authority to free the slaves in the Union, right? He only could do it in the Confederacy because at that point they were not part of the United States. They were basically a territory which he had more control over. So I'm like reading, and then I get down, I'm like, there's nothing, that's not in the book at all, nowhere, right? But like, and there are other things that I did that I left out, because you find these kind of things all the time. Like, for example, enslaved Africans in South Carolina, because there were so many of them. Most people don't realize that South Carolina was more than 50% Black after the end of the Civil War, and because they owned some,
it was a slave port.
Yeah, and they owned so many people, right? So it was more than 50% Black, but they made the enslaved Africans wear a specific type of cotton that was called slave cotton. So they had to distinguish them from like the freemen, right? So there was the freemen. So there was like multiple classes of people living in Charleston, South Carolina at the exact same time. It was the enslaved Africans that were like legitimately just roamed, right? Like we have it in our head that they were like cooped up all the time, but no, it's like when Robert Smalls actually goes, that was a common thing. Like send your enslaved African out to someplace else, and then they have to send the money that they make back to you, with that minus a little bit for themselves to live. So like, I think our understanding about how slavery works in America, and there are a lot of people that actually say, Black people, we shouldn't be talking about these slave narratives anymore. Like that shouldn't be the wellspring of the Black experience, and it shouldn't, right? I agree with that 100%. But so much of this history, the history of the American Civil War, was written in a lot of like it's probably one of the only wars in America, the only wars in the world where the history of that war is written by the people that lost. And so like, while the Union won the war, the South won the PR campaign.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
afterwards.
we're living through that now.
We are living through that now, right? I mean, as a matter of fact, like I didn't put there was a conversation about putting the Confederate flag on the cover of the book. I wanted to put it on the cover of the book. But actually, when I thought about the story, the narrative, it doesn't actually make sense for him to be flying the flag at this point, because he's actually taken it down and put up the white flag.
Which actually begs the question. I could be wrong, but he went back in the same ship.
Yes. He did.
Several times.
So Robert Smalls, like, it's just like Robert Smalls in and of himself. Like we should have statues of him. He should be like,
Right.
if you went to an American school, you
Right.
should have a statue of Robert Smalls outside, because he wrote the law
Right.
that eventually became
Yeah.
funding for the public school system. Like, he wrote that. And this was a formerly enslaved African who, like, could not read and write, stole himself and his family, travels through Confederate waters, right? Then if, like, that's amazing, right? I always like these stories. It's like, oh, that would have been enough, right? That's enough to get a statue, right? But then he goes on to become a captain of the ship, which is the first captain of, like, one of the first Black captains of a ship. Then he becomes a politician. He does all of these different things. He founded the South Carolina Republican Party.
Yeah.
The only reason why I did not put that in the book, I don't think I did, because I couldn't. I couldn't cross. I did. Yeah. Okay. I've only found it like 1 or 2 places, and I couldn't cross-reference it. So, but I was like, you know what? I feel like it's pretty good. So, anyway, so he founds the South Carolina Republican Party, and then, not like Oprah, like 2 or 3 generations after you're a billionaire, this dude goes back to the plantation, buys the plantation that he lived on, and then let his captor live on the plantation.
Well, you know what they call that, right?
Gangster is what they call it.
No. I'm saying it's a house. I can't use it because it's profanity, but it's a what do they call it? You know, when they say it's a, how do you use this phrase? It's a house that you buy, and I can't use the phrase. It's totally inappropriate because there may be kids watching. But it's a screw you house. It's a screw you house.
Yeah.
It's a screw you house. So get what? I'm gonna buy the house, and you know what? I'm gonna let you live on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna let you.
So you'll live out the rest of your days knowing that I bought your stuff.
Yeah.
And you lived on my house. Yeah. That's brass balls, man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's justice.
Yeah, I mean, it's there are a lot of, like, little tiny things about that, like the fact that Robert Smalls as a child is sent off to Charleston, like when he's probably 12 years old, he's sent to Charleston to work. And like, because, and like, this is a thing that still happens today, right? Black and brown children are, like, considered older and more capable than their white counterparts. And so they, like, age them up. And so this is, like, a thing that goes back to that, right? So I wanted to, like, put some focus on that, or the fact that these people had to wear tags like dogs in the books, which I actually almost bought a dog, like actually a formal it's still in my queue. It's like a watch list thing. I keep watching them. You can buy these tags on eBay. You can buy former slave tags. And so, like, I've looked at it a couple times. My people aren't from South Carolina. My people are from Virginia, but you know, like that thing is, like, there's just, like, so many, like, little tiny things that I think we miss in history. When, you know, I was rereading Howard Zinn's The People's History recently, and that idea of the hunter telling the story, and it's always about victory and, like, sacrifice. And so, like, if you look at the Civil War and you look at the history and the way it's told from the point of view of the victor. Like, it's set, like, the gallant South, you know, fighting for a just cause, you know, like, overwhelming odds. It's all of these things are typically what you talk about when you won a war, right? Like, it's legitimately that. But in the Civil War, it's all, I mean, it's just like, there's a lot there's a guy out, like, I remember going through this whole list of things in the book where there was this guy who was, like, making the claim that he was the first person to shoot. He was the first person to shoot at Fort Sumter. Like, he was the first shot in the Civil War. Like, it was like a Confederate general. It's some crazy stuff. Stuff.
Can I ask both of you guys questions? A question.
Yeah.
You know, there's I guess, I don't know if you would call it a genre or whatever, but yeah, we'll for the sake of conversation, we'll call it a genre. You guys are like stars within that historical genre area. You know what I mean? You both, I mean, Mark.
I mean, we weren't on Microsoft commercials with Common saying our name.
No. I knew you were gonna try to do that. Every time I try to say something, he pulls Common out. No, man, let me be the hype man. away with that. We can talk about Microsoft afterwards. Anyway, my question is, you guys are absolute masters of that form. And I wonder, what does it take out of you personally? Because one book is fine. 3 books, not so fine. Then you start going into your other stuff. And although I imagine in the case of Nate, after you finish March, you're like, oh, I'm just going to do what I want. But then the next book is a protest book.
Yep.
It's like, dude, you can move that far. I was expecting to see like superheroes and really get far. But it's like, what does that?
I mean, do you follow Nate on any social media? Like, he is like I always tell people, Nate is like the sweetest guy in person, but on social media, he's like the angriest person.
Yeah,
but he's appropriately angry. He's like appropriately angry.
That's my point. What does it take out of you guys personally to be able to do that work? Because it's not just comics. It really is documenting history. Mm-hmm. Boiling it down into digestible forms so that we can save ourselves moving in the future. So I'm just wondering, what does that do to you guys personally? Because me, I can sit here and say, oh, well, I had some past, but it was mostly spaceships. All right. It was spaceships.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But for you guys, you're doing this hard, heavy lifting. And I wonder, you don't have to get too personal. What's the personal price you have to pay for that?
You want to go, Joe?
No, you go, because I was going to ask you a similar question because your kids are in this book. That's
sure.
Most specifically. Yeah.
But in general, it's like my path is that typically I usually, my solo books are almost always fiction. Save It for Later is actually kind of the outlier that I never intended to do until it was basically serving a therapeutic purpose. But over the process of doing March, a lot of it was a lot of my Jedi mind tricks, basically, that I would do on myself to stay in the framework that would let me do my best every day, had to do with reminding myself ultimately that Congressman Lewis chose me to tell his story through his eyes and in his words. And he wanted me to inject as much of that sense of like expressiveness and self as I could, which wasn't hard at times from growing up in Alabama and Arkansas and having family from Mississippi. I had enough familiarity attached to so many of the settings and the context and the culture. That's where I was able to get some of that sense of life into it. But the rest, a lot of it was going against the deadline, really trying to do my best and increasingly understanding the stakes. And over the course of doing March, that's also parallel with this hard right shift politically and socially in real time. And so like by the end, all of us together, we weren't even really thinking about those questions. Like we recognized that if we just did our job and told this story the best we could, that people who would read it would then have no choice but to connect it with 2016, 2017 and beyond. So like my happy place when I finished March was all of 2017. I was able to just draw Come Again, which was just like demons, disappearing children, horny hippies, and weird magic. I was living, like during the day, I was able to just like live in my make-believe magical realist world, but that let me compartmentalize the other parts. So like equipping my kids to be able to like handle this insane authoritarian power grab at their level, at the level of like 5-year-olds, and being able to do whatever I could to participate as well. Compartmentalizing helped. And the thing that kind of pushed Save It for Later was the fact that by the end of 2017, I realized that authoritarian normalization had already done its own Jedi mind trick on me and a lot of the people I knew. Like the fact that a lot of people, including myself, felt like there was no longer bandwidth to talk about those personal subjective experiences of like losing sleep, losing your appetite, being crappy with your family, like responding in private ways to this social and political turmoil, but also forgetting some of the stuff that was happening just weeks or months prior. And so I was like, I got to write this down. And then eventually, like, I got to draw this. And then, like, I wasn't expecting to do it, but basically it served a purpose to help like keep from getting lost in the authoritarian power grab.
So I don't know if I would say there's anything that takes that it takes out of me, because like, I mean, I say this all the time.
Well, if it doesn't take, what does it cost?
Well, I mean, it's like, I mean, so I feel like once I started drawing the comics as Strange Fruit, the mini comics that I was drawing, that came before Strange Fruit, and then Tales of the Talented 10th. Like at first it was like, I'm just gonna draw like really funny stories, really interesting stories. These are really good stories, right? And then I met somebody at my first book signing. It was at a place in Maine. And as I was doing the stories, he started crying. This guy like legitimately started crying, was like, thank you for telling these stories. And so I like really switched the way I started thinking about this. And so what I want to do is put as much history, much actual history, with truth with a capital T, right? It's like much more complicated than just like, I can say this with historical accuracy that not all people who kept slaves were terrible people. It's proven. It's not a proven thing, right? That's not in debate. It's out there in the world. But slavery as an institution was absolutely 100% terrible. And saying that somebody was good is not a way to like devalue the whole thing, right? If you've read, you know, like for example, when we were talking about doing you know, like wardrobe earlier, like I used 12 Years a Slave as the still shots from 12 Years a Slave to get costuming right. I did that one, and also Nat Turner, Birth of a Nation. But in 12 Years a Slave, you know, if you've read the book versus watching the movie, in the movie, the overseer is very menacing. In the book, the overseer is a different type of character. He's like, he sees it as his role to protect and do this, right? Which is not a thing that we normally talk about when we talk about enslaved Africans and overseers, right? So like, I think truth with a capital T is the thing, is what the reason that I do this is because I want to put as much capital T truth out there about like, without actually varnishing these things, without like, you know, buttering it up, like not making George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or slave masters good, bad, or indifferent, right? It's just like telling the truth of what these people were. So like, I guess the cost for me is to always live in this place where I feel compelled to teach somebody what the actual truth is, right? And if, you know, you follow me on social media, you'll see that I love dunking on like conservative trolls. Like I love, that's just the thing that I do.
Why do you do that, man? What is wrong with you, man?
Well, it's so much fun, specifically when we were talking about when we're talking about the Confederate flag and the debate on the Confederate flag, because we, for whatever reason, we're still debating it, right? And so people will often come at me and like, that flag's not racist, that's not this. And I'm always like, let me teach you some things about history, right? Because you know, if Nate tells me all day, every day that he talked to Tim and Tim told him that the best tool is an iPad Pro, right? And then I go talk to Nate and Nate tells me that Tim's tool is the iPad Pro. But if I look at what Tim is using, and he's using a Microsoft Surface all the time, right? And I see that, and Tim says, I'm in a commercial with the Microsoft, and he's like, and he's
doing, gonna come back, man.
And he's doing all of these things, right? Who am I going to believe? Am I going to believe Nate, who decided after the fact what he was going to tell me about Tim, or am I going to believe what Tim said? And so in this case, when we're talking about the Civil War, I'm never going to believe what anybody who wrote about it in the 20th century, right? I'm not going to believe that. I don't care if you wrote the definitive book on Reconstruction and you say that the multiple ideas about the, you know, and slavery was not, you know, was not about slavery, right? I am going to look at what Alexander Stephens said in his cornerstone speech, which is, this is the first government built with white supremacy in mind. the Confederacy. That's like, who are you going to believe? This random dude on the internet or the president of the Confederacy, this whole other country that decided? Like, he's the expert. Alexander Stephens is the expert, not, some congressman from, Alabama, right? Not like, they're not the experts. It's Alexander Stephens. I'm going to believe them. And so my goal is to always put that out there, because I want to disabuse people of like what it was like, right? Robert Smalls, for the most part, in the beginning of his life, he even wrote, it wasn't that bad, right? He was well cared for. He was a favorite. He had all those things, but we forget that you are still not human, right? Even with all of those things, right? If I were to tell Nate right now, Nate, you can come live in my house. You can live there forever. I will feed you. You will have clothes. You won't have to worry about anything. But if you need to buy something, you need to come talk to me. If you need to leave the house, you need to come talk to me. If you want to go across town, you need to know from me, right? Nobody's going to say, but at least he's got his house, at least he's got a roof over his head, right? Nobody's going to do that. So like, that's the cost for me, is to be constantly in this place where like Nate, I'm always angry, right? Like, I'm always appropriately angry, because people misunderstand history, and they misunderstand it in some really fundamental ways. And it's not, me researching it and telling you what I think about it. It's me expressing the actual truth of that situation. It's not a political thing. It's just like, here's the truth.
So then just to extend that question, then, is that for you guys? Is that your lot in life? Is that what you're here to do? I'm sorry to say it like that, but are you those guys?
Oddly, like, I don't consider myself to be like a nonfiction comics guy, even though that's by far what people know me best for. And I think my craft has gotten pretty good at piecing together nonfiction, working on a new nonfiction one now as a collaboration. So yeah, maybe so. I always have these exit plans where I'm like, all right, like, I always paint myself into a corner with my work, and I'm like, I got 3 books backed up. I'm going to dig out of these 3 books. And from then on, I will have played my cards well enough that I can just like do my weird magical realism for like 5 or 10 years. It never works like that. It's always going to keep pulling me back to doing nonfiction in some form, which is really fine. I mean, like, the fact is also, like, particularly reflecting upon my miseducation about civil rights movement history as an Alabama kid in the 80s with Mississippi, like white middle class Mississippi baby boomer parents. It wasn't until I was in my 30s doing March that I was able to understand exactly how many layers of baggage and multi-generational miseducation my parents had received before they got it to my level, and how much I had carried it forward. So at that point, like, March became very personal, where I was like, I need to smash the kind of cognitive dissonance and all the unpacked baggage that was left on my doorstep by my parents. And that feels like the right thing to do. So yeah, maybe that is my lot in life, Tim, and that's fine. I mean, it seems to be not doing nothing, so I'm cool with that.
Yeah, I always say that my goal is for these stories to be accepted as like a part of American history, and like just like we should be, like, legitimately, I 100% believe that we should have a monument to Robert Smalls. Like, there should be school after school named after him, because he wrote that bill, right? Because I think as soon as people accept that, Black history is not this whole other thing, right? It is an integral part of the American, like, Black people are 13.3% of the population, but how much of American culture is Black culture, right? Like how many, like Nate, you grew up in the South, right? All that food that you grew up eating and all those recipes from those people were all the enslaved people's recipes, right? You think, we think about like barbecue, pit barbecuing, right? Pit barbecuing, it's like an old white dude with like a bandana on his head and like he's got a big pot belly, but that was a thing that enslaved Africans did. So like 13% of the population, but how much of the culture? If you remove Black people from culture, like what does America look like? And so like, I want that to be an integral part of how we talk about history, right? And so like, while I understand Black History Month, and I would never say that we should devalue Black History Month, like having 1 month to talk about these things, give people the opportunity and the justification to only talk about it for 28 days.
Yeah.
Like, let's just talk about this one thing for 28 days. And then once it's done, close the book, put it on the shelf, and then we can go to the next thing, as opposed to talking about it all the time, every day.
I'm going to say this though. Over the last 3 months, we have seen more articles on Black comics.
Oh yeah.
Just this week, LA Times did 2 stories back to back.
Yeah.
Then the week prior to that, New York Times. So we're kind of like broken. I think we've broken through, my friend, the February speed barrier. I think we did the FTL drop. We're in light speed. We're thus far, I can't say it's 12 months, but thus far we've proven that Black history is at least 4 months long. I think we're good because it starts, you got MLK Day in January, but I think we're gonna be all right, man. I think we're gonna be all right.
So we got 9 minutes left for questions.
Okay.
We just I looked up because I was like, how much time is left?
That flew by.
And I figured it was going to do that because it's just us talking, right? And it doesn't really feel like, I know there are people watching because I got the questions come up occasionally, but it doesn't really feel like anything. But like, as much as I like poked him for being in the Microsoft commercial, like one of my listen, let me just be real clear. Like, one of the people that I most want to meet in this world is Rachel Maddow. And one time I turned the television on to watch Rachel Maddow, and this other guy sitting over here, it was on the Rachel Maddow show. So like, once you guys see me on once you guys see me on one of those things, then that's what I feel like. So I don't know if you guys have any questions. There's one of the questions here. We have a couple, there's 3 questions. So, do you have a story from history that you really like to tell in the future? Yes, that question, the story is the story of Black Herman. I just got to figure out a way to tell it. Black Herman was a mystic and basically like a con man, and he was a snake oil salesman. And but it's not a really good story. Like Ella Fitzgerald was a backup singer for him at one point, and somebody asked her about him on the radio, and she said he still owes me money. That was her response to him. But like, after he died, there would be in the newspapers, there were these he would have these people would like write in Black newspapers like to the spirit of Black Herman, I need to find a ring. Can the spirit of Black Herman help me? So and then when he finally did die, people didn't believe it. So they basically set it up as like an event, and they charged for people to come to his funeral. So I really want to do a story about Black Herman. I just got to figure it out. So the other question is, do you use visual anachronisms in your historical graphic novels to help get across information to modern audience? And how do you decide when to do it?
That's a good question.
Yeah, I don't know. Do you do that, Nate? Do you put in?
It depends. Like this is kind of where retroactively you can pass it off as style or flair or an effect. But sometimes you just mess up and you catch yourself as you move along. Like my fundamental example is, especially when I'm telling someone else's story or working with a writer, I really try to remove that flair component. But that first 10-page intro sequence in March Book 1, that was the first thing I did in the book. And eventually I would become so familiar with the topography and the staging and the blocking of Selma and that stretch of road on March 7th, 1965. And that would transform the way that I told it in comics pages. But at the very beginning of March Book 1, that introductory scene was written like by Andrew and intended to be a real view into that day that we would circle back around to. I finished it. We were all happy with it. And fortunately, it brought Congressman Lewis to tears. And so that was sort of like my, okay, let's do this. As the work progressed, I realized that there were anachronisms in, again, going into the footwear, the model of billy clubs, the exact kinds of like guns and gas masks used. There were enough things that weren't lining up, positioning on the bridge, so that I kind of had to marvel no prize myself. And basically Andrew and I were like, look, the very next scene is John Lewis waking up with his alarm clock on election day, or on inauguration day. And in real life, he spent inauguration day with Andrew kind of time traveling, moving through the span of his life and moving through the span of his involvement with the struggle that has led him to this moment. And so basically we're like, this introductory sequence, like either I redraw the whole thing or it has to be his dream processing that day again and again. And so when I circle back around in March book 3, I nailed it. But a lot of that was thanks to just the practice and the repetition of exploring that scene. There are a lot of moments where things don't line up and it's not intentional. It's like it's not being perfect. Yeah. And you find a way out of it.
I don't think I did for the most part in Robert Smalls, but I have in other books, especially like I really like using anachronistic language. So yes. Like I'll have people saying, like people in the during the antebellum South saying things like that's dope or this sucks or like some other kind of thing, right? I do that, and I do that a lot in the book that I'm working on now, which is Stamped from the Beginning. So I'm doing that a lot in there, and I just think that's hilarious. I just find it really funny when you have Puritans saying stuff like no cap, right? Like I think that's hilarious, right? That's just the way I think about it. But I don't necessarily I don't think it helps. I don't think it necessarily need that anachronistic like modern thing in a historical book in order to make people relate, because comics, because of what comics do, the nature of them being words and pictures, because we're visual learners, and that's like legitimately how we think. We all think visually. So when we put the words on the paper, like, and the pictures on the paper, and there's this book called Words and Image by J.W. Mitchell, and he says that whenever you put two things together, words and images, that's mixed media, right? And so it's an ultimate mixed media, like taking the words and the pictures and putting them together. So I don't feel like I need that because people already like relate to it.
It's our burden, man.
What's that?
It's our burden.
It's our burden, right?
But at the same time,
go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, sometimes I think it helps. I think I do the same thing that you do, particularly with slang and modes of speech for like asides that aren't consequential. And I think some of it is like, it's like a little bit of selfish fun, but especially when you are doing straight nonfiction, it really helps to, like, in a way that's not invasive to the information. It just helps to keep it from being too dry. Like, yeah, it's so easy for a historical bit of comics to just turn into dry nonfiction. Like you gotta add just a little bit of like Cajun seasoning and just a little bit of salt and pepper. Like just add a little extra something.
So last question, go ahead.
Where you buy this thing from, man? Because you gotta earn out, dude. Come on.
It's in the there's a link to buy them from the Harvard Bookstore in the chat. So if you want to buy this, also, just as an aside, I'm still giving away that Wacom one that I won because I have a Cintiq that I'm sitting in front of right now, so I don't need a Wacom one. So if you take a screenshot of this and send it to me, email it to me, then you'll be entered into the raffle. Or you can buy a copy of the book. That is the digital version that Tim is holding up, because I don't actually have a full version, but I know there are people out there that have full versions because they keep talking. So anyway, but I'm going to get to this question. What genre have you?
I'm sorry, I have to say that.
That's all right. What's a genre you haven't published in yet? I like, which is really funny because we're talking to, like, Tim was like talking about like, what is your charge? And like, I legitimately want to do a book that's Afrofuturism, but it's still historical fiction. So it's like this idea that I've had for a long time about this alternative history of the Civil War, where it basically becomes an all Black South. The South becomes all Black, or at least controlled by all Black people. So um and I've actually like gone down the rabbit hole of like drawing some of this stuff too, like, you know, in the book, which I think is really funny because and enslaved Africans were like one, like, you know, 10 years after being enslaved, it's like these are lazy, shiftless people. But 10 years prior, it's like, oh, you can take care of my house and you can take care of my kids and you can run the field and I'm going to go drink lemonade on the porch, right? So like you have these people who are saying that. So I'm like, when I'm writing this, like, white people become a stereotype in this all Black South, right? Not the general white people, but the white plantation owners. And so there's instead of like Jim Crow or like the minstrel character, it becomes old massa. Old massa becomes a stereotype and becomes a negative term that Black people call white people in the South, old massa. Not master, massa, right? So that, like, it becomes a different thing. So, and that travels to the history. So like that people will use the word massa, which no longer is connected to the word master. It's now just a derogatory term for white people in a specific place. So like that's the kind of thing that I'm gonna do. But I think we're out of time. If anybody has any other questions, you can type them in the chat. Ooh, Melanie Roth. Melanie, hi Melanie. Melanie says you can buy the book everywhere. And she says my books are coming. So I know they're on the way. I just don't have any right now. So, but thank you guys for coming. That's all. I don't think any.
Joel Christian Gill.
So you can buy my book.
Joel Christian Gill.
Tim's being my hype man. But Tim, Nate, thank you guys so much for like.
Welcome, my friend. Very proud of you.
Coming,
likewise,
just like being able to like geek out for a few minutes and like talk, even though I sound like I have a cold, I just have allergies. But thank you guys, and thanks for Harvard Bookstore for setting us up and having us tonight.
We're so delighted. Thank you. A tremendous thank you to all three of you, Joel, Tim, and Nate. Thank you all out there for spending your evening with us. You can learn more about this book and purchase Robert Smalls at the link in the chat. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, have a good night. Keep reading, and everybody please be well. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, y'all.
I love raccoons.
All right, we done?
We're done.
We're done, man.